here is my secret. Despite all this White House stuff, I am a Canadian dual citizen, and I'm very glad Canada's sponsoring this important event. So, how did we fail? Basically, is the question of this. One of the things I worked on in antitrust and competition policy, I think we did a good job in the Biden administration, and we have kicked things up. And as you may know, we're trying Google at this exact moment. There's a case going on against Facebook, another case against Google. Maybe there'll be a case against Amazon. So there is a determined effort to try to rebalance the power that has aggregated in big tech, and I think that's important. Even if you work for big tech, you might have to admit maybe you have a little too much power compared to everybody else. And that I think is going well. What has not gone very well, I am hesitant to admit, but have to admit, is the goal of getting at some of the core sources of power surrounding data and surrounding data collection, which are often referred to as the privacy sort of debate and the child protection debate. Do you want to come?
I will actually ask you about those things. I know in the last part of your time in the White House, you were actually, I suppose, dispatched to work on the push around privacy legislation, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, and child safety legislation that's been proposed in Congress. Again, nothing's moved ahead. Some folks perhaps in this room would say good news on that, on the child safety bit of it, but almost everyone, I assume, if we had a raise or a vote here, folks would mourn the fact that nothing's happened on privacy. Why not?
Yeah, I think it is. We often said in the White House that this should be pushing like on an open door. Like this seems easy. So for one thing, the American public, when polled, says, how do you feel about your privacy online? Like it's overwhelming that people feel they don't have enough privacy online. Other countries have better laws, although not really good enough. I don't think the GDPR goes anywhere near far enough for what we need. You had industry, which is, dissatisfied with the potential of all kinds of overlapping laws and differences, wanting something. They just wanted something. So they were behind it. Now, not all of industry, Facebook was not behind it, and obviously Google and other companies, but Apple was on our side, the Chamber of Commerce was on our side, Software Alliance. So we had a lot of big things. You had the Republican Party willing to go along with us, and it all faltered on like embarrassingly terrible, turfy politics that I find is like a shame for American democracy.
Led by Democrats.
Unfortunately, our party, I'm a Democrat, some of you maybe Republicans, our party failed. I have to just like lay it down there. We got into strange turf battles between Senator Cantwell and various other people. It's like stuff that's not even, it's just boring to talk about. California, who at one point in the history of this nation liked to pioneer things and then pass it on to the whole country, came out very strongly against federal privacy laws for reasons that they thought were defensible, but to me sound a lot like turf defense and a lot like we have a new, executive agency and we want to do all the stuff. So they got this, they got the Pelosi. Pelosi said she wasn't going to support it. So, we had a pretty strong federal privacy bill. We had a lot of support for it. And it took a big step conceptually. I don't want to turn this to a law school lecture, but I think it's incredibly important that we go beyond the model of the people who hold your data have to be sort of careful with it or delete it or do things if you ask them to preventing the data from being collected in the first place. I think we have to I think everyone knows this, that the notice and consent model is broken. And people have known that for years. And what you have to do is ban data collection in certain forms or make it absolutely limited to what the thing is. If someone has a dog walking app, it shouldn't be collecting everything about you and reading all your emails. It should be about dog walking. And who else is behind us? The intelligence agencies were behind us on this stuff. So like this is a problem. We've created this spy architecture that other countries use, to spy on us. And so we didn't like the forces you might think would be against this kind of stuff were on side, and we couldn't get it done. It was an indictment of American democracy and a little bit indictment of the left, I hate to say, but overall our system of government. So we should have this. Everybody wants it. There should be much less data collected. It should be that which is strictly and absolutely necessary for the functions being performed and nothing else. And that is clearly what we need. And the question is making that happen.
Let me push you a little bit on that question. What, in fact, do you believe the left did to scuttle privacy legislation?
So I already mentioned California, and I think they, if they were here, would say, well, we thought that, they have their side of this argument. But I think that nobody thinks they're being turfy, but it happens. Some of the senators, prominent senators on the left, felt they needed to control the legislation or as in a tit for tat for other kinds of battles, just stuff that's not very interesting. And on what should be the easiest form of protection, child privacy protection, we also failed. There was nobody. If you ask the American public, do you think children should have stronger privacy protections they have now? I think you would get 99.9%, I don't know, whatever support. And, in a democracy, 60% of the people should get what they want. 99%, if it's not unconstitutional abuse of other thing like it's not unconstitutional violation of people's fundamental rights, 99% of the people should be able to get what they want. And children's privacy is in that category. The fact we can't pass it is an indictment of our current system. And I blame the left slightly because we get weirdly involved in battles in the left that I remember it was almost like a political parody. We had some crazy battle going on between some of the LGBT groups and some of the eating disorder groups were like fighting with each other about all this kind of stuff. And I know people have interest. I know they feel very strongly, but we are failing to do stuff. And if you are on the left, it's partially our fault.
And yet there are some
children's protection. I mean, the Republicans have not been that bad on that issue. I am ashamed to say we're worse on the issue of children's protection than the right.
And yet we do have, these kind of Trojan horse concerns, right? Senator Marsha Blackburn said some very wretched things lately about how COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, could be used potentially. Someone will find the exact quote, but essentially to sort of police children's interaction with transgender issues and ideas. So perhaps some of these concerns are real.
Our view was not that view. We didn't obviously agree with Senator Blackburn's statements. It's very difficult to police what Republicans are going to say or do. But I think the basic goal of a children's protection law, actually related to the last panel, is we wanted to force companies to spend more on trust and safety and on children's protection. That's all we wanted to do. The president felt that was very important. We didn't want Facebook to be firing 20,000 workers or, whatever they call that Twitter company, to be firing all their staff who take care of this stuff because they're too afraid of liability. That's what we wanted to accomplish. I have friends in trust and safety at companies who won't disclose. They're like, the United States isn't really putting much pressure on us. So no one, they're not really after us. Europeans get after us. All you do is occasionally have a hearing. We show up, they yell at us for a couple hours, then we go home. Yeah. And okay. And then we know we don't have to do anything. So they don't have to really spend money on this at all. And until we have someone, forget about these sessions where you yell at them. Unless they're facing billions of dollars of liability, they will not hire and keep the people to really make this happen. I mean, companies are for-profit institutions. They respond to financial incentives that look like billions of dollars, not like mosquito bites. And we have failed to do this. We have failed to create the incentives to make companies invest seriously in trust and safety. And that's what we wanted to do. And we've gotten distracted by a lot of stuff. We've let this pass. And I think it is a disservice to our children.
So I want to step back and let's talk about competition, antitrust, the scale of tech firms. How many people here work for a large technology company? If you're willing to raise your hand, a company that measures its revenues in billions. Okay,
Well, I'm trying to get more money for your trust and safety. I'm on your side.
there you go. And they're probably in those departments. But let me mush a few ideas together and maybe give
Yeah.
you a bad question that hopefully you'll give a good answer to. I saw your former White House colleague, Dr. Alondra Nelson, who's deputy director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, talk recently at Columbia at the Knight First Amendment Institute, and she talked about the relationship between technology and that idea of the poly crisis, all these complicated, issues that we face in the world, whether it's climate change or interstate conflict or what have you. And she noted that in some ways of sort of depicting the poly crisis, tech is often sort of off to the side. It's sort of, frontier technologies and, maybe some aspect of disinformation, misinformation, cybersecurity, et cetera. And she was arguing, tech is actually related to all of these larger problems. In some case, underlies, and in some cases, in conversation with, and reflexively, related to these things. So, if you accept that premise, right, I want to ask you the problem of scale in the current tech ecosystem. How does it relate to the quote unquote poly crisis? Is it in there? Is it part of that sort of complicated mash of ideas?
Well, I'll say first that Alondra Nelson is awesome, and everything she says must be correct. But moving on from that, the problem of scale was the greatest challenge of the 20th century at some level. And even though I think there was a moment in the early 21st century when people thought we had moved on from scale, or that life was fundamentally different, or that like small businesses and small startup stuff were going to rule the world. That hasn't happened, and we're back with scale. Scale is a almost wonder drug. It makes possible many things that seem magical, but I'm also reminded of the saying that where something has gone wrong, something is probably too big. And so, I think that almost all the challenges we face in contemporary, all these poly crises at some level, not uniformly, but many of them linked to the problem of scale and things getting beyond human size, beyond our easy capacity to deal with, whether that's populations, whether that's systems, whether that's schools, airports, tech companies, you name it. And so and I am, in my heart, this child protection and privacy are my sort of side gig. At core, I'm a structural antitrust economic person. And I think that getting a handle on the dangers and possibilities of scale is core to building a future that works for everyone. Now, I've said a lot of abstract stuff. What does it mean a little more concretely? As I said, I think in the early 20th century, people had thought that the advantages of scale had disappeared, that little startups like Google were beating big companies like Microsoft, that little bloggers were beating existing news organizations, that, the advantages of being big had disappeared. That all seems like a bad joke 15 years later, or not a bad joke, but a passing moment. I mean, there are still times where people have individual success and so forth, but, go try and launch a e-commerce site to compete with Amazon, and odds are you're going to find it a challenging thing. And the main reason is Amazon has an extraordinary scale. Try and launch a search engine that competes with Google and their scale of daily usage and so on. So in all these areas, scales become this extraordinarily important competitive determiner. And I think the problem with scale, there's a lot of problems with scale, but mainly I think from an economic equality standpoint, scale tends to concentrate wealth. When you look over the economies of the past and over the course of humanity, the most sort of concentrated scale economies, like, you know, in the PlayStation model, have concentrated much wealth and created dangerously unstable systems. So that's what I'm worried about. I know it's a very vague, but you said it was an open-ended question.
Absolutely. And so let's make it a little more close-ended and talk about news of the day. Google now on trial in the government's suit against it, the first of two related to competition and antitrust. And I understand you took the train and joined the trial yesterday.
I was there. That's true.
How did it feel in the courtroom?
I thought it was fascinating, exhilarating, almost like going to a free TED Talk. Um, well, actually, a mixture of like Law and Order and TED somehow.
So you had Hal Varian, the
yes,
economist for Google, delivering his sort
well,
of statements.
the
And
first thing they did was to put Hal Varian on. And Hal Varian is the chief economist of Google. He has a little bit of a resemblance to Bill Gates. So it had a little bit of a like 90s feel to it. And he certainly had kind of the mannerisms. I don't, people here are probably too old to remember, but Bill Gates was deposed in the Microsoft trial back in the 90s, and it came off terribly. He kept like arguing and saying, being annoying, and everyone sort of had liked him sort of, and he came off as sort of evil nerd kind of figure. And Hal Varian, you know, they'd ask him questions like, you know, is a search on Google give you a broader set of results than a search on Amazon? He said, well, I don't know if I can answer that. Depends what you mean by the word broad. He said, well, more sources of information. Well, really, it's still hard to say. Can you be a little more, like went on and on like that for hours. So I kind of enjoyed that. I don't know why. And then, but then the most,
you're a lawyer.
the art of good lawyering is something. And I mean, there's a reason people like legal dramas. But the most interesting part, the government's core case, is that despite being, you know, relatively cheery, friendly place, Google, that Google has been very aware of human behavioral tendencies, including habit, the effect of defaults on choice making, and has used, you know, since its search engine kind of rose to popularity because it was clearly better than what was around, but since then has been very thoughtful and careful about subtly maintaining itself and its market dominance and shutting out potential competitors or starters by using its money to make sure it has the defaults, takes advantage of habit, and does a lot of subtle things to keep it there. And they had a professor from Caltech who's a behavioral economist, and that's why I was saying it was like a TED Talk, because he was talking about all the various and then proving with Google documents that they were aware of this and trying to sort of manipulate people so that they generally ended up with Google. So that is the core of the antitrust. I just, you know, obviously I work for the Biden administration, so I hope the government wins. But even just as a effort to understand what power looks like in the 21st century, the subtler forms, I think 20th century power is much more industrial or military. Now it's more about controlling people's attention, subtly shaping people's decisions, scale in a different way. And the trial is very good at trying to understand what economic power looks like 21st century.
So let me ask you, if the DOJ case fails, what's at stake? What if it fails? What does that mean for this project to potentially address 21st century economic power, the network effects, all of the sorts of ideas that you're working on? How does it affect perhaps the other case about Google? We've got another one coming up around market dominance in digital advertising. And how does it affect the case against Facebook?
I think there's two things I'd say. First, I think that while the Google trial is about the 2010s and the deals that Google made with Apple to stay out of search, I think that's the main indictment, is that Google paid off Apple to stay out of search. That looking at the past, it'll matter for the future and specifically for the AI markets and the ongoing contest for what commercial AI looks like. Google feels threatened by what's happening in the AI market. Um, they have obviously their own products are rushing and the question is, in some ways, whether they can use the tactics that they used in the 2010s, the soft economic power is talking about for the next contest. In terms of the second thing I'd say is, I think that if the government loses all these cases, we enter an era of long-term monopolization where the big 3, 4, 5 tech companies are pretty entrenched. And the government will have effectively blessed the models that these companies use to keep competition at bay. In Facebook's case, it was buying its major competitors like Instagram and WhatsApp. Case of Google, it's all sort of money related. Paying to be the default, paying to keep Apple out of search, paying to make Samsung make sure that it doesn't develop a different search alternative. I think having blessed those techniques, I would predict that those companies stay in their seat of power for much longer than is natural or healthy.
And if there is any example of an entity on the planet that seems to be sort of wherever you can point to problems with it, it seems to be because even the humans working there don't really understand how it works or how the system operates. It's Google, in my view. But let me ask about with regard to AI. This is a big week for AI in Washington D.C. We've had, I think, 3 AI hearings in the Senate this week. We had the Senate Majority Leader hosting the first of his AI forums, largely populated by men in suits who run large technology companies. Lots of discussion about what to do. Should we have a standalone agency, an FDA for artificial intelligence? In your view, what's the best path forward? If we do find these firms in this unassailable position, is there any hope for AI regulation?
Well, there's certainly the potential of AI regulation going forward. By the way, the men in suits, I'd call them men who have put on suits for the occasion, but feel very uncomfortable in suits and look strange in them. But that's my sort of snarky remark. I feel that I am speaking slightly against my former employers, concerned with the direction of AI regulation, mainly because I approach these questions from a structural power issue. I'm mainly interested in power and its rebalancing. I mean, the fundamental reason I believe in the cases against Facebook, Google, and maybe Amazon, it's not because I think they're particularly evil companies. I think there have been much eviler companies and are much eviler companies in history. I just think any overly concentrated power is dangerous, and the longer it stays there, the worse it gets. And that rebalancing is necessary. A sort of constant rebalancing is necessary for the health of any long-term democracy or economy. Actually, that's what my next book is about, which I am trying to write, about the constant cycle of trying to rebalance power in a democracy and a long-term sustainable economy. So I'm worried about the current round of legislation, that it is shaped by many of the big players who, frankly, seem interested in it, largely to insulate them and make them the player. Now, I think they have legitimate concerns too, and I think government doesn't want us to be conquered by evil robots and is concerned that it was behind the ball. But behind it should be and is this question: is this leaving the market to 3 players? And that's what I'm worried about.
Let's talk about just briefly. We only have a couple minutes left. With regard to labor issues in artificial intelligence, what are you concerned about at the moment? I mean, we've got everything from the Hollywood strike and this sort of focus on writers and the extent to which creatives may be replaced, on through to headline after headline about the way in which people in global majority countries are being employed to look at the worst stuff and build the classifiers that are going into these large language models for $1.50 an hour. How do you think about the labor issues around artificial intelligence broadly?
Well, let me start with labor first. And feel very strongly it's about time labor got its due, and that we have neglected the interests of workers for far too long in this country. For 40 years, we sort of took labor as a cost and thought that was fine, when actually it was us. You know what I mean? And focused entirely, especially in antitrust, but all these areas, like in directing all our efforts to try to make stuff cheap, and no concern about producers or workers. And I think the White House this White House, now I'm going to sound like a person, but I really do believe the president wants to change that, has tried to change it. We had unions come in all the time, and we very focused trying to make things better for workers. So that's my political message, but I believe it. The AI and labor issue, I think, is complicated. I really think the history of predicting technology's effect on work is filled with gross errors that are almost embarrassing. In the 50s and 60s, anyone who studies this knows that everybody predicted, because of more advanced technologies, that the work week would fall to 30, 40, 20 hours. There's a Life magazine issue from the 60s somewhere that's called like the crisis of leisure. What are we going to do with all this free time? And instead, even though we have these advanced, we have email, things that seem impossibly magical. We have, telephones, we have email, we have baby monitors. I don't know, you have everything. People work more than ever, for less money. Most families have two people working. Not against women being in the workforce, but it is striking that at one point, in the 60s, they thought, we'll only have to have one member of every family work for 20 hours a week. That'll be enough for everybody. And now most families have two people working, killing themselves. Sherry Turkle was talking about children being neglected, and someone asked a great question about, like, what is this? So this is crisis. So, we've been wrong over and over about what technology will do, and I think we'll be wrong about AI. My kind of fear about AI is not less that we'll have less work, but that AI, that will all kind of become middle managers. Once something becomes potentially more efficient, suddenly everyone's asked to do more of it. So, if you might have been asked to, say you're a lawyer and you're asked to file one complaint a month, and then AI makes it possible to write complaints a lot easier, suddenly you need to write 20 of them a month. We have this weird tendency when things get more efficient. Emails made it more possible to communicate with, so we communicate more. And in some weird converted way, instead of there just being some amount of work we have to get done, I think humans have a weird capability to invent or create work, or something happens, or we need to be more efficient or do more work. And I don't fully understand the mathematics of it, but I have a weird feeling AI will make us more busy, but we'll be supervising 100 AIs. And we'll all kind of be middle managers and not doing any work, what you might call real work ourselves, like actually doing the writing or the creation or the drawing or the things that are kind of rewarding, as opposed to supervising the AIs that are doing it. And that is kind of what I fear. I fear kind of for the human condition. This is sort of a 19th, kind of go back to 19th century Ruskin kind of, what is the quality of the work that we do? And how does that matter to the human experience? I think we forget that sometimes. It's not just the amount or type of work, it's the satisfaction. Marx had a little bit on this, alienation of labor. You think it's alienating to be in a factory line. What about just being someone who sits there approving the products of others? So there you go.
I think we are pretty much out of time. Can I ask one more question, David? Okay, I've got 3 more on my list, and then we'll finish up here. Okay.
3 more questions.
They were, why do we need a robot penal code, which I know is something you've written about.
Yes.
Is there a decoupling looming where, to some extent, the outside of maybe these 3, big tech firms, we can't even have the technological imagination for where AI is going? Is the federal government investing enough in avoiding that circumstance in public sector and in university investment? That's the second question. And I suppose the last one, you can choose which of these you want to answer. What should the folks in this room do about any of this?
Okay, I'll take the first question, because
robot penal code.
Yeah, robot penal code, because I think our approach to AI regulation right now is kind of wrong-headed, in the sense that there is a lot of slightly more abstract concerns about kind of cataclysmic events and things, not all of which is unjustified, but a sort of, at least in government, lack of attention. I know a lot of people in this room are concerned about this, but lack of attention to obvious, more real, visceral harms like advanced fraud. I know people here are worried about electoral fraud, but and so forth. And I think in some ways we're not being tough enough in those areas. In some ways we're over-regulatory with AI, potentially over-regulatory. In some more abstract sense, you talk about licensing to use AI, and much under-regulatory when it comes to the clear, concrete harms that are going on. A good example of this is what we're pressuring tech companies to do. I think we, in some ways, put pressure on the hardest thing, which is misinformation, and not enough pressure on the easy, it's not easy to deal with, but more obviously concrete in its harm, which are things like the sexual abuse of children and other very visceral, real-world harms. So I think we should have a robot penal code. I think it needs to be strong and include death penalty for robots.
You heard it here first. Tim Wu, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.